Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be reading Seneca. This will be episode 2 of the series where I'm going to try to break down multiple passages from Stoic literature. This topic's going to be a little bit darker than the last one was, and honestly I feel like this is where we should start, because Seneca in this book specifically is where I originally got the idea to undertake this project, creating audio journals about specific passages. And this one is called Letters from a Stoic. It's a pretty common, well-known collection of 124 letters, and this is basically from obviously Seneca's perspective because he's the one writing the letters, but he's writing them to Lucilius Jr., who was a procurator for Sicily during the reign of Nero, which is really an interesting dynamic as we start to dig a little bit further and kind of discover Nero's relationship with Seneca, as when Seneca came back from exile and started pretty much his tutorship of Nero. With that being said, Seneca is probably one of my favorite philosophers, and I'd like to do a lot of these type videos on him specifically. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time the beginning of this kind of going through his life, what he did, how he lived, how he died, and a little bit about his personality, and then two topics that seem to be of pretty significant debate amongst his detractors. So Seneca was originally born in Spain to a relatively unrenowned family. Despite all of this, he quickly became pretty heavily involved in Roman law and politics. Now, this was really quite interesting because that didn't typically happen a whole lot, especially in this era. Now, irrespective to his apparent obvious likability to be able to climb so quickly, he was sentenced to death twice throughout this period of time. Now, the first time was under Cassius Dio, in which the story basically goes that Seneca was kind of showing him up. Cassius Dio was jealous of Seneca's ability to orate and to speak and to sway people's opinions with his words, which is a very interesting, an interesting claim. After reading quite a bit of Seneca before in the past, you start to learn a little bit about him, and I start to have my doubts about it just being a matter of jealousy and maybe more of the content of what Seneca might have been saying to or about Dio. Now, the second death sentence is a little more interesting. Regardless of its validity, it revolves basically around accusations of adultery between himself and the emperor's sister. Now, as I just said, the truth behind these accusations are for the most part unsupported, and there obviously was a lot of ulterior motive at the time to kind of get rid of Seneca. He was considered dangerous by the new ruler Claudius's consort Messalina. Luckily for Seneca, Claudius had his sentence commuted to exile. During this time, he spent 8 years on Corsica, and this time out, I guess you could say, Seneca, he wrote 2 works. One was called The Consolation to Helvia, and the second, The Consolation to Polybius. And this kind of brings us to one of the criticisms of Seneca, and it was in The Consolation to Polybus that Seneca spent a significant amount of time in his letters trying to work his way back into the good graces of Claudius and be able to return to Rome. That in and of itself wouldn't be terrible if it wasn't for the fact that he did ultimately come back to Rome when Claudius married Agrippina, and she petitioned Claudius to bring Seneca back. And then obviously we know what happened to Claudius. He ended up being killed, or at least we think he was killed, and Nero took over. And then Seneca wrote a work, and I'm going to do my best to pronounce this. It's called Apokalosintosis. And basically in this work, he kind of talks a little bit of shit about Claudius, this guy who he was pretty much kissing his ass a little bit to get back to Rome. And now now that he's dead and the new ruler is taken over, he kind of puts Claudius down and brings Nero up on a pedestal. Now, it really is quite unfortunate that Seneca is so heavily associated with Nero, seeing as how the last years of Seneca's life were spent, tutoring Nero and mentoring his leadership. But I will say this, that the first 4 years of Nero's rule were relatively successful and peaceful, and a lot of people attribute that success and that peace to his Seneca's influence on Nero at that time. Now, unfortunately, we know how this story ultimately ends, and there was a plot that was discovered called the Pisonian Conspiracy, and it was a plot to either overthrow or kill Nero at that time. And at this period of his rule, he was hyper paranoid. He didn't trust anybody. There had been other attempts on his life prior, and Seneca was thought to be associated with this plot, although history tells us now that it was very, very unlikely. At any rate, Nero did order Seneca to kill himself, and this time Seneca would oblige. Now, Seneca himself is he's quite a colorful character. I really enjoy his writings. I like the level of humanity that he has. I can see whenever he's angry. I can feel whenever he's insecure. I see his mistakes. I see his insecurities. I see he just seems so much more attainable and reachable emotionally than, say, Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus. And I'd like to talk a few of the criticisms about Seneca, because I believe this is so important, especially for us moderns, to really understand that Stoicism isn't about perfection. It's not about being some sage. It's not about, being perfect and living 100% up to everything that we say, although we may strive to do so. It's quite impossible to actually do it, and Seneca is a perfect example of this. So one of the first criticisms was that he was wealthy. Now, Seneca has defended this multiple times in his works, basically stating that attaining and maintaining wealth is stoic in nature, and he's quoted as saying, "Wealth is the slave of a wise man and the master of a fool." Now, basically what this is stating is that if you're wise, you control your wealth, and if you're not, your wealth controls you. So this is somewhat a stark contrast to the stance that Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus took, which is more or less about bringing the bar down rather than reaching up with wisdom, is what Seneca basically just said. Marcus and Epictetus really hammer home that wealth is irrelevant, it's not important, we shouldn't strive for it. If it happens, great, but it's definitely not virtuous by default. In my own personal opinion, selfish goals and desires are very similar to the heads of a hydra. And if you're familiar with Greek mythology, basically a hydra is a dragon with multiple heads, and anytime you cut one head off, two springs up from it. And I can tell you one thing, that every time in my life that I have sacrificed myself or my virtues to reach towards these desires, I've been disappointed in what I ultimately got. Every time that I've thought that I was taking a shortcut or taking an easier path, I've always been disappointed in the result. The pursuit of wealth should not be the goal. It surely shouldn't be what you base your self-worth on. I do feel that it is highly likely that someone who lives a life based on the four pillars of Stoicism is going to find success. Now, whether that success includes money is completely dependent upon your walk in the universe and what fate has in store for you. If it does involve money, then that's great. That's your fate, but it should be equally amazing as if it doesn't involve money. It shouldn't, your life's happiness and how your success is measured shouldn't be dependent upon your bank account. We as Stoics believe it's completely irrelevant whether or not we have a lot of money. Now, of course, we need to be self-sufficient, and we need to work in society and not be dependent upon society and handouts. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, to the extent at which we desire things above what is needed is to the extent at which we start to step outside of the bounds of what we control. And to finally bring this home, Memento Mori, guys, just remember that you're gonna die. Like, if you have a nice coffin, what good is that gonna do you? And if you do find yourself in a position where you do have a lot of money and the capability to give back, I would suggest that that's what you do. The only way that you can really push your money beyond your own mortal life is to spend it in a way that it benefits generations to come. And it's important that we leave the world in a better condition than whenever it was given to us in the day that we were born. Wealth is a tool to reach the end, but is surely not the end itself. That was the first criticism, which was the fact that Seneca was a wealthy guy. The second basically is concerning what I mentioned before about his letters to Rome when he was writing to Polybius. A lot of people consider that hypocrisy in the sense that it violates the concept of amor fati, which is to love one's fate. And honestly, I don't even really take this criticism too seriously, because anyone who has any concept of Stoicism would know that it really doesn't make much sense. Nowhere in Stoicism does it say that we have to passively lay down and just accept whatever happens to us. That's not at all what Stoicism teaches, especially with concerning virtue. We're supposed to fight for virtue and against, evil and against vice. To just say because something happens to us, our only option is just to accept it as is. And there's nothing that says that even if we do fail in a pursuit, that we can't try again and again and again and continue to try. But no matter what, in each attempt, we have to be happy and accept whatever the outcome is at that point. There really isn't much more to be said on this, but let's be happy that he did petition to have himself returned, because like I said before, the first 4 years of Nero's rule were tempered by Seneca. His rule would have been so much worse had Seneca not come back and been a part of his life. Seneca is, in my opinion, an altogether more relatable Stoic philosopher in his dualities, his insecurities, and his fears. Within each of us, there is a shadow personality, and anyone familiar with Jungian psychology will very much understand the importance of coming to terms with that aspect and not making an effort to stuff it down inside, or even worse, pretend that it doesn't exist. To expect a person to be perfect is to be deluded yourself. How many times have you fallen in love with someone only to find out 2 months later that they are human and they have defects? And for some reason, you're surprised every time. How many times have we become fascinated with an idea or a philosophy only after more study to find it shallow, or at the very least not nearly as grandiose as we originally perceived it to be? No person or idea is infallible, of course, and one should never hold either in such high regard that they become exempt from scrutiny, but to act as if, because a person is not perfect, are the perfect example of the ideals that they teach, that what they teach has no merit, is just ridiculous. So many people in today's world think that they don't have a shadow, or they don't have these negative aspects, so much so that to even look inward and accept it is a pain that they cannot bear. Whether we want it to or not, those negative aspects of ourselves will make themselves apparent in moments of crisis or despair whenever we're our weakest. If one has an understanding of the flaws within them, they can, to an extent, integrate those aspects into their being in a much more controlled manner and rein in the darker impulses. To not acknowledge it is to turn your back on an enemy simply because you believe they are not your enemy. It's a perfect way to get stabbed in the back and caught off guard. Now, Seneca was not a perfect person, just like the rest of us, but unlike the majority, he was able to temper a lot of those aspects and ultimately become quite a force for good in the world, stretching from his birth until modern day. Now, there are two ways we can look at Seneca. We can look at him as an example of a man who failed to live up to his own teachings and be a perfect example of Stoicism. Or we can look at him as a man who was in the midst of a heroic inner struggle and striving to overcome those defects, just as many of us who find an interest in Stoicism today do. It's in striving for ariete that we get the opportunity to sharpen the blade of Stoic teaching. It's all about continuous progress based on learning from the mistakes and monitoring behavior and emotions. To expect to wake up one day in a state of apatheia and live the rest of your days in moral perfection is the quickest way to ensure it will never happen, and worse, may instigate the stifling of valid emotion, only to have them bubble up later in a destructive tirade. To expect moral perfection, in essence, is anathema to Stoic philosophy, for it places an expectation on an outcome, or rather demands it. Seneca understood this and understood his own failings, following up with a lot of effort towards growth. I believe this is all we can ask of any person alive today or in the past. I'm by no means an apologist for Seneca. That's not what my intent here is, but I do want to make a case for judging the merit of teachings based on the teachings themselves and their impact on those that learn them, not based off of the mistakes of the teacher himself. It is unfortunate, but especially in the arena of psychology, some of the most groundbreaking information that has completely changed the way we view human consciousness has come from people who were less than perfect, to say the least, and had done and said some pretty horrible things. But luckily, we didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater in that case, otherwise we would have set ourselves back significantly. I promised myself I would make this brief, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this part of the talk. I, of course, will never pass an opportunity to talk about human imperfection, me being a very imperfect person. I find it far more interesting than perfection itself. How boring would that be if everyone was perfect? So the quote we're going to read today comes from Letters from a Stoic. As I said before, it comes from letter 4.5. It's going to be on a topic that is a little bit darker than what we spoke about before, but it's one of my favorite topics to meditate on and to think about, weirdly enough. And now the quote goes like this: "Rehearse this thought every day, that you may be able to depart from this life contentedly. For many men clutch and cling to life, even those who are carried down a rushing stream clutch and cling to briars and sharp rocks. Most men ebb and flow in wretchedness between the fear of death and the hardships of life. They are unwilling to live, and yet they do not know how to die." So letter 4, as it is written above, actually isn't contained within my copy from Letters from a Stoic. The digital version I use on my phone does have it, so if you can't find the passage, I would suggest a quick Google search. There's a couple free copies of Letters from a Stoic online in PDF version, and they, at least the ones that I use, have had this actual passage, which I would highly recommend because the whole page or that whole letter has some great insight on the topic of death. My initial reflections after reading the whole quote is the fact that if there is one line that seems to pierce every anxiety-ridden man's heart, it is the fear of death, which to me can be synonymous with the fear of loss or failure. I know in many cases for myself, I have feared failure far more than death at different periods of my life. And in Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death, he states that if individuals were to grasp the full significance of their impending death, they would be overwhelmed with anxiety and despair. And for the sake of argument, I would like to use that last quote as kind of an axiom for what we build the rest of our interpretation off of. That being that the default state of a person who understands the significance of their own death is crippling anxiety. This puts us in kind of a peculiar situation in which the answer seems to be further delusion in order to overcome death. The statement implies that the most commonly used tactic to not live with anxiety of death is to hide from it psychologically. For some of us, this may work for a period of time or for our entire lives, and the extent to which it is effective, I believe, lies in the extent to which a person is aware of their own existence. There are many who live their lives pretty much as a dog would. They wake up, they work, they feed, they sleep, only to repeat the process again tomorrow, without much thought and without much introspection and without much worry. Or, so one would think, it can be argued that nobody can truly do this, and that although consciously the person may not be comprehending their own death, subconsciously it is wreaking havoc on their emotional well-being. Now, there's a darkness on the edge of all of our consciousness, and death is the monster therein. One way or the other, we will have to face it. We can either walk into the darkness and we can seek it, or we can hide from it until it finds us unprepared and vulnerable. In essence, we are stuck in this psychological limbo in which many wander aimlessly until that monster has discovered them and reaped its toll. I ask you then, what do we have to fear by pursuing the truth on this matter? If we know we will ultimately have to meet this darkness, why then should we not meet it on our own terms, having been armed with the knowledge of its implications and, of course, its fallacies? We have everything to gain in this pursuit and really nothing to lose. If we fight that battle now, it doesn't mean we will not eventually die, but the horror of the fight itself will be behind us. No longer walking in limbo, hearing the footsteps of the beast just out of sight, but rather slay it in the present and banish the anxiety of the hunt from your mind forever. For the fear of death touches to one extent or the other every aspect of our daily lives, whether consciously or subconsciously. Now, those are my initial thoughts on the whole passage. Let's go ahead and do what we usually do and zoom in on the first part. And I quote, "Rehearse this thought every day that you may be able to depart from life contentedly." The first step to this process is actively acknowledging that you're going to die. Bring it into your mind that there will be a moment, either tomorrow or 20 years from now, when you will leave this life forever and everything that's undone is going to remain that way. Understand that eventually the delusion, reinforced by a million distracting pleasures, will eventually be smashed, and the clarity of how much time was wasted is going to come crashing down on us. Think of that moment, rehearse it, prepare yourself for it, in the same way that a soldier prepares for war by engaging in mock wars. A soldier does not wait until he's on the battlefield to think about what his response is going to be. Momento Mori, think and meditate on your own death and understand that as soon as that's here, it's going to be gone. A month, a year, 20 years, all seems like the same amount of time when you're looking back on it from death's vantage point. Even if you know as a fact that you won't die for another 30 years, this process would still apply simply because as soon as the sun rises tomorrow, 30 years will pass. And if you are prepared emotionally when that moment does finally come, it won't be as a monster materializing from the darkness, for that monster will have been long slain, and all that is left is to step graciously from this life into whatever awaits after. Which brings us to the next part of the passage. For many men clutch and cling to life, even those who are carried down a rushing stream, clutch and cling to briars and sharp rocks. Now I want to ask another question. How important is staying alive to you? What or who would you be willing to sacrifice in order to take another breath? I believe many of us hold high ideals as to what we would do in those situations, but fortunately very few of us have ever had to make a tough decision like that. Now, as I stated before, the first time you've thought about it doesn't and shouldn't be the moment in which it's actually happening. And with that, I'd like to quote from one of my favorite movies called The Fountain, in which a character states, "Many of us go out the same way we came in, kicking and screaming." Many of us are so eaten up with anxiety, just the thought of death is unbearable and can result in severe panic attacks. Can you then imagine the response of your mind when you're actually nose to nose with death? So let's look at another quote from Ernest Becker's book, Denial of Death, and it goes, "The real world is simply too terrible to admit. It tells man that he is a small, trembling animal who will someday decay and die. Culture changes all of this, makes man seem important, vital to the universe, immortal in some ways. Us Stoics do hold humanity in high regard as it concerns our reason and our logic, but to say that we are destined for anything other than death is to lie to ourselves. For all things we may potentially experience in life, there is really only one thing that we're guaranteed, and that's death. And maybe taxes, as the saying goes. It seems really quite silly to sacrifice our virtues and our self-respect to gain a few more years of an already anxiety-ridden life. One of the more tragic aspects about human existence is that our minds and our consciousness are immortal, or at least they feel immortal, but are trapped in a very mortal body that will eventually fail us. Our essence tells us that we should live forever, or worse yet, that we could live forever if we just worry enough about it, or to the contrary, don't look at it at all and pretend that it isn't there. Another quote from Ernest Becker, "The knowledge of death is reflective and conceptual, and animals are spared it. They live and they disappear with the same thoughtlessness, a few minutes of fear, a few seconds of anguish, and it's over. But to live a whole lifetime with the fate of death haunting one's dreams, even in the most sun-filled days, is horrible." We as Stoics cannot follow this path, even if we want to. Only the dumbest of us are able to actually do this, and even then, unless the brain function is severely inhibited by some disorder, I doubt many of us can even enjoy this luxury. As Becker states, animals lack the foresight and the fear of the future, and also the fear and the worry of the past. So they're spared this concern, they're spared this dread of what may happen. With that, we as humans start to try and project our immortality out into things such as having children, creating a timeless work of art, amassing enough wealth to secure multiple generations after you pass, or find some cure for some common illness. Many of these drives are driven by the fear of death, and we will claw, grasp, and fight to preserve our sense of immortality. We as Stoics don't fight to preserve our immortality, and we aren't in denial of it either. We neither run to death or run from it. We confront it, for you'll not have to wander far in the landscapes of your consciousness to find it there waiting for you. To follow up the first part of the passage, if we do not confront death and accept it, we may do horrible things to ourselves and to others to preserve our lives in that final moment. As one of the pillars in Stoicism is courage, and we can hardly be courageous if our primary driving emotion is the fear of death or the obsession to live as long as possible, even if we succeeded in gaining a few more years at great expense to others or self. To what kind of life are we extending? A life filled with anxiety and fear of death? This is what we call a catch-22 or a lose-lose situation, which ultimately leads us to the last part of the passage. Most men ebb and flow in wretchedness between the fear of death and the hardships of life. They are unwilling to live, and yet they do not know how to die. I'd like to start with a personal example. Now, this is a little bit less serious in nature, but I do believe it's relevant to elaborate on how the mechanisms of the mind operate. Now, I cannot stand having long fingernails, but I also don't like taking the time to cut them. Therefore, until the desire to have cut fingernails outweighs my dislike for cutting them, I remain passive. There are many today who unfortunately live in this fashion. Every day, life becomes more and more unbearable until the desire to live becomes less than the desire to die. And then the person makes a permanent decision to solve a temporary problem at great expense to their family and those they care about. Most cannot imagine the type of pain someone must be in to resort to suicide. And I honestly don't take a pretty common approach where I look at it as cowardly. It actually takes a very strong, in its own way, person to make that final decision. And unfortunately, it's usually motivated by complete and utter hopelessness. Although ultimately the ends are the same, we as Stoics don't reach death in that manner. We understand that it is truly just as important to learn how to die as it is to learn how to live. Learning how to die is as much a part of life as eating, drinking, and multiplying. It is a necessary process that every one of us must go through if we're to live lives in accordance with nature. By living a life that causes enough pain that we're unable to cope with the daily comings and goings, and by not facing the truth about the destiny of all human life, we find ourselves in the same limbo I was speaking about before. During the day, one finds life unbearable and feels like death could be an acceptable end to the suffering, and at night, when we lay down, the concept of death feels unbearable, and that we should cling to life with every ounce of energy that we have. The constant waxing and waning between depression and anxiety has become all too common in today's world. Now, what I just stated is one way that we can face our end, but it's definitely far from being the ideal way, and there are other options despite what many people who struggle with this believe. Marcus Aurelius is quoted as saying, "It is not death we should fear, but rather never beginning to live," which brings us back to the essence of the conundrum we find ourselves in. Marcus is pointing out that if we're going to worry, let us worry about the right thing. The concept of living and moral excellence and accepting death are two faces of the same coin. One begets the other. We can never face death graciously if we're not living in the like. It is really quite impossible. We can't face the end with courage if we live as a coward, and in reflecting on death, it gives us the power to live in virtue. We cannot have life without death, nor death without life. These two truths are tied by fate, and by addressing one, it addresses the other. By meditating on death, it will ultimately lead you to the way you are living, and by meditating on living, and as a byproduct of living in accordance with nature, death becomes conquerable, at least in our acceptance of it. Death has no power over the man who doesn't fear it, in the same way chains have no power over the slave who has freed his mind from emotional bondage. Throughout Stoic literature, we hear the comparison between the slave and the emperor, and how the slave living in accordance with nature has his freedom, while the emperor is chained to his impulses. There are ultimately two goals in life that are a requirement to live in freedom: to learn to live in moral excellence, and to learn to die with courage. Until we have done those two things, we are just an animal locked in a cage. Only unlike the animal, we don't have the luxury of not being able to see our ultimate end. So as I promised myself I would keep this one a lot shorter than the last one was, I'll go ahead and leave you with the famous Stoic dog quote, which comes from the perspective of a dog who has been leashed to a cart. And the quote goes, "The fool is like a dog who tries to sit down or run in the opposite direction, but is dragged along roughly by its leash anyway. The wise man is like the dog who keeps pace with the cart, for whom things go smoothly because he accepts and he adapts to his fate. I say to you that upon your birth into this world, you have been leashed to a cart so you can be drugged, kicking and screaming, unable to view the beauty of the journey as the cart travels through life, or you can accept your fate and trot willingly with the cart and view the scenes of life as you go. Either way, the cart is going to the same place. Now, which dog are you going to be?" With that, I'll say thank you for taking the time to listen, and I wish you the best in the week to come. Maybe tomorrow when you wake up, think about what dog you're going to be. Stop fearing that whatever moment, if it's good, is going to end. Stop trying to extend that happiness longer than it should. Things come and go, moments come and pass, just like your life. And when the moment comes finally for your life to end, we have to accept that, and we have to do it willingly. Make your last act on this earth one in grace and ultimately one in peace.